Okay, so let's kick off. Thank you for being here today and welcome to AI Fights Back. This is our 12-week webinar series where we're helping business to learn about what value AI can bring to them. Today we have a special guest, a journey towards trustworthy AI with Claire Dillon. Claire, welcome, and thank you so much for getting involved and supporting us in this. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Dillon. And Claire, thanks so much for joining us here today. Claire spent 8 years working in Microsoft, leading their developer experience and evangelism team. She's also worked with incredible Irish startups like Havoc and Iona Technologies, and she serves on loads of boards in the digital area throughout the country as well. I've worked with her in Talent Garden, and she's a fantastic speaker. And today she's going to talk about a journey towards trustworthy AI. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you for inviting me here today. As Ruth said, I have worked for, nigh on over 20 years now in the technology industry. And for the last number of years, I've been working with a large number of organizations, basically helping them make sense of the latest technology trends and helping them understand, how they can actually leverage those for their own innovation. And that's kept me nice and busy actually for the last number of years, because the amount of innovation we've been having in the last, say, 5 years or more has been really phenomenal. And so much so that people are talking about it as the fourth industrial revolution. But when I think of all the things and all the topics you could cover in the context of the fourth industrial revolution, for me, artificial intelligence is probably the most interesting. And I think that's probably because it kind of touches on every area of innovation that's happening at the moment, because there isn't probably one area where artificial intelligence isn't being used in terms of the research or in terms of implementation or in terms of thinking about how it's being rolled out. So I think artificial intelligence becomes one of the more interesting topics. And when we think about why it's getting so much attention in the press and in various different areas, for me, it's probably to do with the fact that it has this huge potential for economic growth. So when we think about the impact of artificial intelligence on the economy, it's huge. And all the analysts are saying that. So when you look at the figures, they're saying that it can potentially add $13 trillion to the current global economic output by 2030. Now, that's a phenomenal amount of money. And when you think about the idea that right now, there's lots of us going into recession from a worldwide perspective, and even before the current pandemic situation, there was a lot of talk about productivity lines going flat and growth going flat. AI has this potential to really kickstart growth in our economic, in the global economic output. And $13 trillion or 16% is a huge amount. That equates to about 1.2% annual productivity growth in a given year. And to put that in context, if you think about the first industrial revolution in the 1800s, when we moved to steam power, that was about 0.3% of economic annual growth and productivity. So when the analysts would say that AI has a huge potential to actually beat that. Spend is growing. Every time you look at any of the IDC reports in terms of what the spend is on AI, it's growing. And pretty much people are accepting now that almost all the applications that are being built from an enterprise perspective are in some way going to leverage AI. So it's hugely important. I particularly think that AI has the potential to be a huge benefit to the human race. Whether you're talking about it being used in healthcare, when you're talking about it being used to help address some disabled people's ways of working with the world, when you think about all of the huge problems that we have to address as a race, like agriculture, climate change, in all these areas, AI has a huge potential to have a benefit. Even if you look at where we're going now with the current COVID situation and the current pandemic, AI is being used across the board in so many ways in terms of how we can tackle this. I saw this diagram from the OECD policy response to COVID-19, and it's talking about where AI is being used to help combat COVID. And I'm thinking, gosh, look at all the areas where it can actually be used in terms of early warning systems, in terms of diagnosis, in terms of predicting probability of infection, to help people track and do contact tracing, and get information out via social networks and maybe combat fake news around this, in terms of delivery with drones for high-risk areas, in terms of service automations, for example, Canada's COVID-19 chatbot, or when you're looking at how we even monitor or track our economic recovery. In all these cases, AI has a role. So you can see that when we move to the future, AI has a role in so many places. But of course, there are some big names and some big brains out there who are saying that AI, there's risks associated with that. And of course, that's true. The late, great Stephen Hawking said this quote in terms of the fact that it could spell the end of the human race. And of course, he was talking about general AI, artificial general intelligence. And you know, it's probably true to say that we are not there yet, and that there would be risks associated with that. But when we're talking about the idea of artificial intelligence, we don't have to go to that catastrophic place before we start thinking about how do we make sure that when we build or buy an AI system, we're doing it in a way that is accountable, responsible, and transparent. And I think this is really important. Like, why should we care? When we think about AI ethics, is it really just a kind of a philosophical, theoretical discussion that makes us all feel good that we're doing something nice for the world? I don't think so. I think that for two reasons, it's something that every business needs to really care deeply about. The first reason is if you get it wrong, the consequences can be catastrophic. We've seen instances already where people are not necessarily doing what they need to do to make their AI solutions accountable, responsible, and transparent. And it has a huge impact on either their employee relations or their customer experience, or in fact, even their share price. And I note that in 2018 in the US, it was the first year that more CEOs were let go because of ethical lapses than because of poor financial performance. So this whole idea of having poor ethics is becoming a very real financial consideration for organizations. But even more than that, in my mind, if AI is to really reach the potential that we think it has to actually impact the human race, then we have to build trust in it. If people don't trust AI solutions, they won't use them, they won't let us build them, and that will really slow down the potential for AI to have a really positive impact in the world. And that's why I think that this idea of looking at AI ethics is an incredibly important one, and not just for technical people. And this is a drum I will continue to beat, because we cannot abdicate the responsibility of ethical AI or trustworthy AI to just the technical community. This is something that everyone in business, everyone in society has to take a role in, because it's only without that involvement, we won't get to a place where AI becomes accountable, responsible, and transparent. So when we start thinking about AI ethics, I remember when I first looked at this, and I am no ethicist, I'm no expert in ethics, but when you start looking at it, you begin to realize fairly quickly that this is not a black and white problem, right? I mean, ethics is not necessarily terribly well defined. But what is true is that you can pretty much say that what's legal in the world isn't necessarily equal to what's ethical. So there's kind of a continuum between what's legal and what's ethical. And you can do something that's legal, but it can be unethical. But chances are, for the most part, what's legal starts to kind of come closer to being what's ethical. Over time. Over time, we as a society make our rules and regulations and guidelines so that we get closer to being what's ethical. But it is important to understand that this is not black and white, and it is a continuum. In fact, if you think about from a legal perspective, AI does appear not necessarily in GDPR or the regulations themselves, but in the associated guidelines, there are a lot of references in there to individuals having the right to not be a subject of a decision based solely on automated processing. And we think about the idea of data controllers must notify consumers, including the existence of automated decision making. So we're starting to see references to AI coming through in regulation and guidelines like GDPR. And I think that there's going to be more of that. So I think it's very important to realize that, you know, first of all, what's legal and what's compliant in the world of AI ethics is changing, and we have to keep on top of that. But secondly, it's not enough just to be compliant. It is important to think about the fact that this is a continuum, and you really want to always be on the far right of that continuum where possible. So the first question is, where are you on that ethical continuum? And when you start thinking about trustworthy AI, again, there are many lenses through which you can look at this issue. The European Commission has a report out on the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI, and they do a really good deep dive into the various different 7 areas that one has to consider if you're really looking at ethical AI. And looking at trustworthy AI. And they cover everything from human agency and oversight, understanding where that's appropriate, making sure that your solution is technically robust and secure and safe, thinking about privacy and data governance as a whole area by itself, thinking about the transparency of your application, perhaps whether or not you might use explainable AI, thinking about whether or not you are addressing, making sure that your AI solution is in no way discriminatory and that it embraces diversity and fairness, thinking about the societal environmental well-being, and then making sure that your organization is accountable for whatever you build. And it's very important for these issues to be addressed, not just in the planning phase, not just in the building phase, but actually throughout the life cycle of your entire AI system, even after it's been released. So this is a continuous effort that you have to undergo when you're building or buying an AI solution. So today we're going to talk about a few stories about when AI goes bad, just to give a few examples of the potential pitfalls that some people have found themselves in order that we can look at how we can perhaps keep ourselves out of those pitfalls. And when we talk about when AI goes bad, I'm not talking about the armies of killer robots, right? I mean, to be fair, there is a very valid argument about the fact that it's a very relevant discussion to talk about things like lethal autonomous weapons and how we should perhaps outlaw those. And those discussions are going on, with governments and with human rights groups. But on the day-to-day basis for business, I don't think that the killer robots or the autonomous weapons are something that might concern you. So let's have a look at something that I think is a little bit more, probably quite as risky in terms of potentially the scale of the impact, but probably may be a little bit more relevant to businesses. Because in my mind, there are some cases when AI can go bad, when it all starts with a very friendly, how can I help you? Like perhaps a chatbot or something like that. I've used my own photo in this one, and I note that it was from a time before COVID when I had a hairdresser. But nonetheless, the idea being that sometimes you can have chatbots which start out looking really innocent, but can actually have quite a negative impact on our work and life. One example about this, or how AI perhaps was used in an inappropriate circumstance, is Centrelink, which was an Australian program that the government put in place to actually look at welfare fraud, benefits fraud. And what's interesting about that is that they decided to have a semi-private organization look at this problem, and they built an autonomous decision-making engine with a private company. And then they outsourced the entire running of this program, and in fact outsourced the debt collection associated with, and in fact incentivized the company based on how much money they could collect on the back of it. And this caused huge issues, because it turned out that this program had a 20% error rate in terms of positive hits when they didn't actually create or when they didn't actually have benefits fraud. So with that kind of error rate, with a 20% error rate, when it's aimed at some of the most vulnerable people in society, when your only point of recourse was actually to go and call a call center in a different country and be put on hold for ages, this caused a huge, huge issue. And I remember when I saw this story, I was thinking, whoa, I mean, that's just so bad. Can you imagine the impact on people, some of the most vulnerable people in society, in terms of being told that they were actually making fraudulent claims when they weren't? And then when you think about the idea that people were debt collectors who were being sent to their door, that's huge, right? I thought that was bad until I came across the story of what happened in Michigan in 2015, where they did something similar. They also wanted to crack down on benefits fraud. But it turned out their system had over 20,000 false positives. That was a 93% error rate. So they were actually going out and trying to recollect debts or collect debts from people with a 93% error rate. And when they brought in this automated decision-making system, they actually fired all their human resources they had looking at this issue. So there were no oversight, no human oversight. And you think about these problems and you think, that just should not happen. When you're looking with vulnerable people, when you're thinking about something that affects people's well-being, there were some suicides as a result of that program in Michigan. And that's a really, really bad thing. And of course, not every AI system can be fair either. Like there are cases of, like this case, which is Northpoint AI systems, which are being deployed in most courtrooms across the US. They actually they're deployed to actually calculate the rate of recidivism or the likelihood to reoffend. And when ProPublica did an expose on this, they said that actually in the cases of people of color, they were more than twice as likely to come up as high risk. So some would say, well, maybe that's because the historical data sets were biased and that's what happened there. But one of the bigger problems with this particular service is, for me, the fact that it's a private service. There is no way to actually look and see what is happening, why it's happening. So if you are a defendant or if you are a person in the public, there's no way to actually check why you have come up as high risk. And in a case where you could be put in jail or not, I think that's a pretty big oversight. And of course, racial bias comes up all the time, and particularly in the area of facial recognition. This lady on the slide, her name is Joy Buolamwini, and she's a Rhodes Scholar, and she's a Fulbright Scholar, and she's a scholar in many, many places, and a researcher with MIT Media Lab. And what she found when she was actually looking at some of the facial recognition algorithms was that it was more likely to recognize her face when she wore a white featureless mask than when she used her human face. And that's a really bad thing. So Joy actually decided to set up an organization called the Algorithmic Justice League, which I think is absolutely amazing. I've always wanted to be part of a Justice League, but they're doing great work in terms of actually highlighting bias that may be present in commercially available AI systems and helping combat that and helping train people on how to address some racial bias in the systems. But not that long ago, they actually did some research on Amazon's recognition, facial recognition. And Amazon have been trying to sell this to police and security services. And they found that actually for women of color, where there was a particular feature where they were doing gender analysis, but for women of color, the error rates were up to 31%. So again, when you've got a politically charged situation in the US, and we can see that this week, where racial biases are already embedded, one would say, in their society, bringing in technology which can hard codify that bias is a very dangerous path to be on. And it brings us to the broader question of facial recognition technologies at all. Last year, in fact, California became the third state in the US to actually ban facial recognition software from law enforcement. And it was partially due to the racial bias that had been identified by people like Joy. They'd actually ran an experiment on folks that were in government in California, and it actually misclassified people who were part of the actual establishment as being criminals. And that helped to kind of get that over the line. But there has been a growing sense of concern around the use of facial recognition for law enforcement. So much so that there was actually a draft publication in the EU last year that would suggest that the EU were thinking about looking at regulating this. They since backed down from that and have left it to individual countries. But there is a huge concern from human rights groups across the world that in some cases, in many cases, in fact, facial recognition is just not ready yet for use by law enforcement. And it can cause too many false positives and too many issues when people are trying to, when people might be misclassified and have negative consequences on the back of an AI decision. And of course, one might argue as well that even if you invest in this kind of technology with the current situation and the fact that we're all going to be wearing masks, it might be useless anyway. So I think this whole area is an area that is very current, and the discussion is ongoing. But there are many places where facial recognition can potentially be a benefit to society, but there are lots of places where perhaps it's not ready for use yet. And it's not just in facial recognition either. Racial bias has cropped up across the board. There was this one report last year again from looking at the racial bias in hate speech detection in Google. And what they showed was that if the tweets were using African-American slang, they were 1.5 more likely to come up as being offensive. Now, again, this is an issue that you might think is a big deal if it's just like flagging something in Twitter, but when it starts being codified into systems whereby many of the tech giants are looking at how they can automate the idea of stripping out offensive speech, when you have these systematic errors at a very fundamental basis, it can be really bad and can kind of skew the whole effort in a way that makes people not trust it. So that's a concern for everyone. And of course, I've focused a lot on some of the racial issues and racial biases that have cropped up in the last year. And that's partially because it's such a concerning topic in the US. So there's lots of research done on it. But that's not to say that's the only place where bias can creep in, or the only group of people who are negatively affected by this. In fact, when you look at ethics, and because it's not necessarily an easy topic, even our definition of what's ethical can change from culture to culture. I thought it was really interesting to look at this report from MIT Media Lab. They did an experiment called the Moral Machine, where they asked loads of people from around the world to assess various different examples of the trolley problem. So many of you may be aware of the trolley problem. It's a classic ethics problem. You've got your train, car, or trolley coming down the road, and it can go on path A or path B. And on path A, in this case, there's a baby, and on path B, there's a grandma. Which do you go? You have to choose. You have to choose one or the other. So which do you choose? And they posed lots of these kinds of ethical questions with different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds on A and B, or different groups of people. And what they found was that actually the answers differed, but they correlated to the culture in which you lived, which I think is incredibly interesting. So when you think about cultures where there was a kind of a more leaning towards collective, family oriented, where the elderly were respected more in that respect, people tended to save the grandma. But in other cultures, which may have been more individualistic or thought about the potential of the individual, they tended to choose the baby. And if you look at the results from the Moral Machine experiments, it's fascinating. They also showed that, for example, in places where they had more instances of people breaking the law, then they were more forgiving of people jaywalking, for example. Or where there were places with huge economic inequality, people started making decisions based on people's socioeconomic status. And when you start getting into that level of detail, you realize that this is a very thorny issue. Not just for autonomous vehicles, but I saw another report actually in Canada where they were looking at getting people's opinions, crowdsourcing the idea of who got which in a transplant list. How do you prioritize people on a transplant list? And they were crowdsourcing the answers. And when you look at the transcripts of the discussions around that, it's kind of shocking, because you've got people, making decisions based on how many children the people have, what age they were, their ability to actually have a job. And people start making these ethical kind of considerations without maybe thinking about the fairness that might be associated with them. And it's incredibly important to realize that the cultural differences are there as well. And of course, sometimes some of the AI that's being built in this day and age is actually built on very shaky foundations. So the AI itself might be completely correctly implemented, but perhaps the assumptions upon which it's built may actually be questionable. So the AI Now Institute is a foundation that's based in the New York University, and their whole reason for being is to look at the societal impact of AI. And they have recently called, in their last report put out in 2019, they called for a ban on emotion detecting tech, or affect recognition. And the reason why they did that is because it is in particular been seen to actually be based on science that is not necessarily well proven. So a lot of people, you'd see this crop up in some HR applications, for example, where people are kind of looking to say, well, was someone engaged on that interview when they're doing analysis of, for example, video interviews? And they would claim to be able to do emotion recognition in that respect. A lot of that technology is built on some scientific research by a psychologist called Paul Ekman, who was around in the 1960s, actually. And he defined 6 classic emotions and started looking at facial expressions that were associated with those emotions. But since then, it's been proven that there is a much greater variety in terms of the types of emotions that you might have. And indeed, the kinds of facial expressions that people make when they have those emotions vary greatly. depending on your culture, depending on how you're feeling that day, depending on the weather. Like if you're in the sun and you squint, is that seen to be a sign of, mistrust? So it's sometimes the actual science upon which the AI applications are being built is not necessarily great. And so the AI Now Institute were particularly called out a number of areas where people's decisions are being made on people's livelihood and things like that, perhaps shouldn't be actually based on an AI decision at all. Now, there are some cases where, for example, emotion recognition in very constrained, contextualized scenarios can be very useful. Like, for example, sometimes in medical areas where they're looking at people's responses to pain, for example. But in many cases where it's being applied at the moment, it's not necessarily a valid use of that technology. And I always like to include Microsoft's Tay, which most of you will probably have heard of this story back in 2016, where Microsoft brought out their chatbot Tay to great fanfare. It was their chatbot that was going to talk to millennials and learn their way of speaking and get on with them. And of course, within a couple of hours, some bad actors had decided to train Tay to be essentially racist, biased, homophobe, Nazi. I mean, it was really bad, and Microsoft had to take down Tay within a couple of hours. And I always think about that story, and Microsoft have put their hand up and said, look, we shouldn't have done it. We've learned a lot, and in subsequent releases, they were more careful to check for malicious use like that and bad actors. But you gotta think, did someone not think to say, there's people out there who don't like you very much, Microsoft. They may actually try to do something mean with Tay. Have you thought about that? Do you think you might try and stop it? And for me, it's really important that anyone who's building an AI system is very cognizant of the fact that there are always malicious actors. In fact, if anything, cybercrime and being able to actually misuse AI technology is on the rise. And it can be very dangerous not to necessarily think about that and to perhaps test for that, maybe even with some white hat hacking or something like that, whereby you actually get people to try and break the system and try and do bad things just to make sure that they can't. I remember giving this talk somewhere, and someone said, oh, well, that'd be the triple D test. And I was like, what triple D test? And he was like, well, you need to check to see what a deity would do. So if a god took this and they had all power, what could they do with it? If there was a deity test, a dunce test, so you pick someone who's really dumb and see what they could do with it, and a despot test. So if you pick someone really evil with a lot of power, what could they do with it? And it's important to maybe think about those triple D tests when you're building your AI system. And of course, there's another area, a whole area for discussion around this idea, and it relates to that third point of transparency. When you think about how AI is attempting to be human, attempting to be like a human, and that's a great endeavor in a lot of cases, but in some cases, perhaps not so appropriate. I was actually quite shocked when I read an article about some AI-empowered toys. And the CEO was talking about how this toy had been built to help children build relationships and empathy. And my first thought was, I don't want an artificial intelligent toy teaching my children about empathy and relationships. I don't think that's probably a good, necessarily first role model from that perspective. But he ended the article talking about how the toy was actually going to become friends with the child. And if you didn't give it enough attention, it had been taught to make you feel guilty. And I was thinking, what is that? I don't want any toy. I'm not paying money for a toy that has actually been built to make my child feel guilty. What kind of solution is that? And for me, that kind of approach to how you would use AI is probably very, very flawed. And when we're thinking about AI deceptions, we have to mention the whole idea of deep fakes, because AI is getting so sophisticated now in certain areas that it can generate really compelling social content that people believe is real. So if any of you haven't seen the deep learning AI generating deepfake videos of the Mona Lisa, have a look. I mean, it makes the Mona Lisa have a chat, and you'd swear the painting was coming alive. And there have been loads of cases out there, even already, where people have put out fake videos of politicians saying things they didn't, and all sorts of other things like that. I read recently, in fact, that even in terms of the Twitter campaigns at the moment that are actually looking for, say, the Open America campaign, for example, that about 50% of those Twitter accounts that are actually trying to promote the idea of Open America may be bots, right? So what we're seeing is that AI has the potential to be used in a bad way to actually potentially impact our our society, the general health and well-being of our community and society in general. So these are, of course, areas where I'm sure no one on this call or listening to this would ever be venturing into, but they are some places to be cognizant of the fact that these are potentially bad uses of AI that one would want to avoid. And it relates to this whole idea of, even when we think about how we roll these things out, how are we treating people in our workplaces? Amazon came into the news there recently, where it was actually using an AI automated decision-making system to track workers' productivity and fire them if they didn't meet the right productivity measures. And there was a journalist who did an expose of this in the UK, and he was finding that some workers were like peeing into a bottle because they didn't feel they had time to go to the toilet because of the actual stringent measures that were being put in place by Amazon. So that's not necessarily a good thing, but it's not just factory floor workers being looked at from a productivity perspective. The impact on employees of how you choose to roll out AI and who you choose to even sell it to can have huge impact. So in the last year, we've seen employee walkouts at all the big tech giants when they were objecting to the tech giants trying to sell their artificial intelligence programs to sometimes the American government, or it may be in particular to ICE, to the folks doing controlling immigration in America. And there were huge employee unrest on the back of that. But even if you take away those large scale protests, I've been witness to some smaller organizations who've been trying to roll out AI solutions, and they've been blocked by either unions or by workers' councils because they haven't thought to engage those people at an early stage and to go with them on the journey. So they feel like AI is happening to them instead of with them to augment what they do. And that kind of tension with employees can be very damaging to anyone's ability to actually roll out successfully an AI program. And the last area that I think is interesting is this idea of what impact AI solutions can have on the environment. It's not an area I would have thought of. Again, this came up in one of the AI Now Institute reports. And when I read it, I was actually shocked. They were talking about an example of a machine learning, of a natural language processing algorithm. And the training of the algorithm released as much carbon emissions and had as big an impact on the environment as 125 flights from New York to Beijing return. And some people are saying that actually over time, the whole AI industry could have as big an impact on our climate as, in fact, the airline industry. So that's huge. And I think it's something that perhaps people maybe need to think about because, for example, even now, we can make decisions on the back of this. So, you know, if you're building an AI solution, if you're training it, you might want to have a think about perhaps what cloud provider you're using, because some of them are using 100% renewable energy and some of them are only using 50% renewable energy. So when you think about where you want to deploy your AI solution, maybe have a think about what the relative impact on the environment might be when you choose one cloud provider over the other. So there's some of the fails in terms of where people have gone very wrong, I feel, in terms of their AI solutions. But there's loads of places and there's loads more guidelines now about how people can avoid some of these things. I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about how to do that. There are lots of guidelines around this, but some of these tips that I'm putting here are kind of like your starter for 10. You know, when you're thinking about either building or buying an AI solution, here are some of the things that I would hope that you at least start to think about. And the first set of tips are really when you're planning what you want to do, when you're building your strategy. And I think one of the first points to note is that you really need to decide where you are on the ethical continuum. So we had that discussion about being legal and being ethical. If all your conversations about being compliant, just about being compliant, and I hope you're at least being compliant, right? So if all your conversations are over about thinking about compliance, thinking about just making sure that you're just by the letter of the law, abiding to GDPR and other regulations, then you're over here in terms of just being on the legal side. But ideally, if you really want to future-proof what you're doing and ensure that you don't have any of these other related issues, you maybe want to think about moving over and stating so that everyone's very clear that you want to be on the more ethical side of things. And related to that then is about what your business case is. So when you think about your AI implementation, it's important to connect that to a valid business case and think about what are your measures of success and your measures of failure. Like what would happen or how could this go wrong? And to make sure that you think about that in advance. Again, I was quite shocked to see that some of the AI implementations that are looking at just automated processing, they often have an ROI sheet where they're talking about people saved up in the corner. And when you talk about roles saved, they're really talking about roles being made redundant, right? And I was looking at that thinking, bemoaning this to some folks at an event at one point. And someone said to me, well, actually, it can get even worse than that. And I said, well, how can it get worse than, having an ROI where you're literally saying jobs cut, and that's the only way you're thinking about it. And he was saying, well, I was actually part of an organization where someone went with that ROI sheet to the head of IT. And he said, that's all fine and dandy, but come back to me when you've got names beside that number. And I'm thinking to myself, that's dreadful. I think that might even be illegal. You can't be going around putting names in beside a number without, consulting HR. So I do think that when we just focus on these pure number things and we don't actually think about the broader impact of the AI solution on our organization, we can run into trouble. One way to actually perhaps think about this is to look at this ethics canvas, which you can find at ethicscanvas.org, and it's available under Creative Commons. But this was actually built by the Adapt Centre in Ireland, which is one of our AI research centres. And I really like it in terms of just, most of you would be familiar with canvases, but it's a nice way to think about how you might look at the ethical impact of your AI solution. So it might be something you might find interesting. So the other thing you might like to do is have a look at the assessment list for trustworthy AI. The European Commission Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI that I referenced earlier has an actual pilot version of an assessment list that you can take to just checklist, did we do various different things that would help you ensure that you're more towards that ethical side of AI. And then it's really important to include all relevant stakeholders. And this is back to this idea that we don't just include people, for example, from HR when we're thinking about how we roll out AI solutions, if it has an impact on staff, but maybe even start thinking about working with the staff themselves to hear more about how and where they would prioritize AI implementations. And I think this is, I heard one CIO talk about how they approach this. And I contrast it against the idea of, bringing out an AI chatbot and causing an industrial relations issue versus this approach, which was with the chat with Leia Healthcare. And what they did was they actually went to their workforce and said, well, where are you feeling the most pain? What do you hate doing? Let us take that and let's automate that. And I thought, well, isn't that a lovely approach to actually involve people in deciding where you start with your AI journey? And in doing that, they made sure that they got buy-in from the staff and they had a really smooth rollout of that AI solution in the end. And I thought that was a marvelous approach. So it is really important when you're thinking about AI solutions to think about who are the relevant stakeholders, and in particular, who will be the end user impacted by this, and make sure they have a voice in raising risks and understanding the benefits to kind of double check that. And then you might want to think about whether or not you have a need for transparency in your AI system. There has been a rise of research in the area of open or explainable AI, and particularly in Europe, because of these GDPR related guidelines that people are saying, well, if I can't explain how an automated decision-making system came up with that decision, perhaps I'm not able to use it. So there has been investment in explainable AI looking at how they can improve that scenario. And then when you're getting started, it's incredibly important to build a diverse team. Now, I know this is hard because whatever about having diversity in tech, the diversity in the AI scene, in gender in particular, but in all sorts of ways, is actually very hard to find, right? So maybe start thinking creatively about how you can do this without necessarily, searching the world for all the female data scientists who, are in short supply, perhaps. But think about the idea that if you have a team building this, maybe they can be cross-functional. Maybe they shouldn't all be data scientists and computer scientists. Maybe you need a sociologist. Maybe you need someone who knows about ethics. Maybe you need someone who has a background in organizational and behavioral design. But these are kind of roles which, number one, would be great to bring in a diversity of thought, but also number two, potentially also could have more other diverse attributes that could help the team as well. And then educate, because this field is changing fast in terms of, again, what's legal, but also in terms of best practices about how you would address some of the challenges. So it's incredibly important to make sure that there's time for that to keep up to date, because it is a field that's changing so fast. And not to mind the fact that, things are changing, but even the services that are available that you don't have to build yourself are changing. So, it's a good idea to bake in time for that. And then build a risk mitigation plan, whereby you understand what you will do as an organization if things go wrong, because hopefully you've already planned for that in terms of what might go wrong and done a risk mitigation plan. And then when you're building it, track your data sets. It's as important to track where the data is, where it came from, how it's changing, as it is to understand what your algorithm is doing. So tracking data sets becomes incredibly important. Testing is essential. And what's really important is that, like, the continuous testing, and not just while you're building it, but after launch. You have to keep testing, right? Because the nature of many of the machine learning algorithms is that they will change their nature over time as they encounter new data. So it's really important to keep a focus on testing even after your AI solution goes live, to monitor the usage scenarios, where it's being used, how it's being used, and then be as transparent as you can. So how you're making decisions, or what rules might be baked in, or what you've learned from the AI system, or even the fact that it exists. I think it's good practice to be as transparent as you can with the people who are being impacted by the AI system. So there's some of my quick tips that I would hope will help get you on a journey towards trustworthy AI. It's an incredibly interesting space. As I said, I think it's incredibly important for people to consider these challenges, as well as the technical challenges, which I know are great. But if we don't have a look at some of these ethical issues and making sure that AI is more accountable and responsible and trustworthy and transparent, if we don't look at those things, we risk people not trusting the solutions we build, and that will only delay us all on this journey towards helping AI make the world a better place. So thank you very much.